welcome to this episode of Questioning Behaviour, where we get to ask all of the interesting questions about a very interesting topic, including the who, the what, the where, and also the why.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy.
And today we are actually questioning the behavior of information security, or rather, why are we so goddamn awful at keeping any of our information secure, and why do we not seem to prioritize it?
Yeah, I mean, information security, for me, comes down to just terrible and predictable passwords, like I guess everyone else on the planet.
Yeah.
Which seems like an obvious trap to fall into. You know, if you want to keep your stuff safe, you should probably have a good password that's not easy for people to predict based on your information. But we seem to do it nonetheless.
No, I have to admit, when it comes to my socials, none of the stuff is very well protected. I think all my social stuff has the same password. Also, probably not something that's really smart to admit on an online podcast. Nope. But then when it comes to my work and my data, that is all encrypted. So I feel like that in that case, I'm doing quite okay. How about your stuff? Is it encrypted or not?
I think so. I think I know about as much as encryption as sort of Excel lets me do, which is that I just click a button and it tells me it's encrypted and I believe it. So
very good.
Yeah,
very good.
But it seems like we do fall into some quite predictable traps, especially even with like phishing email scams. We still see them going on,
Have you heard
right?
from my best friend, the Nigerian millionaire prince, yet?
Wait, I thought he was only
Oh
talking
no, he's
to
talking
me.
to everybody.
Oh. I feel so betrayed. I thought we had a real thing going on.
I'm afraid you did not have a real thing going on. No, what I love about these things is that, I mean, we're laughing at them now, but like these Nigerian prince scams, or you can come up with any type of outrageous scam, from a behavioral science point of view, there is absolutely no explanation for why you would fall for these, because very often they are written in a way that they should... they should make a 5-year-old question the validity of that very email, and yet they seem to be very successful. And of course, phishing scams have definitely updated since the Nigerian prince. I'm pretty sure. Oh
yeah. I think with any sort of phishing scam, we always see a bit of an evolution, right? A bit of the attackers kind of figure out what's working, what's not working, and almost A/B testing themselves into people's information. Yeah. Which is a little bit worrying. Yeah. I mean, hopefully we can find out a little bit more about information security and all the different ways that we can ourselves do more to protect our own information. So who are we talking to today, Mela?
Today we are talking to Kelly Shortridge, who actually knows a lot about information security. She has actually started and sold a very successful startup, and has then moved on to bigger things, but she continues to be in the information security, or the InfoSec sector, and she's actually looked into applying behavioral science to it, and I'm quite curious as to what that looks like. So take it away, Kelly.
So we are pleased to welcome Kelly as our guest expert on this episode. Kelly, how are you? Thank you so much for coming on the show.
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. Would you mind giving us sort of a brief sort of background on who you are and how you got into behavioral science?
Absolutely. So I am currently Vice President of Product Strategy at Capsulate, which is an enterprise Linux protection company based in New York City that doesn't require a lot of behavioral science in my day job outside of what's generally required for product management. So most of my applications of behavioral science have been separate from my day job, on nights and weekends into my own personal research territory. And I got started with it really in undergraduate school, studying behavioral economics, and continued to be in love with it after I graduated. And when I first started covering the information security industry for my job as an investment banker, actually, I realized there were tons of strange dynamics within the information security market. And there were certainly an abundance of irrationality that I could see among the practitioners in the field. And so it's almost like I couldn't help myself but start applying different behavioral science concepts to the industry and trying to figure out like, why is it so broken and what can we be maybe doing better?
You said you studied behavioral economics undergrad. Where did you do that?
At Vassar College, which is a very small school in the US, but has a great economics program.
If I'd have known there was a behavioral economics undergrad, I would have skipped straight to that for sure.
Yeah,
that's excellent.
It wasn't totally focused on behavioral economics, but certainly there were a few professors there interested in it, and one professor dedicated to it, which for a small school was pretty rare.
Incredible. So you said that you started off in investment banking.
So I did initially, yes. I transitioned from being, one of the masters of the universe, I think as they called themselves, over to actually being a startup founder. That was my first gig, so to speak, after being an M&A banker. And my startup was acquired. And then I decided to go into product management because in some ways it is similar to behavioral science because you have to understand the why behind things and why people are doing things the way that they're doing them in order to better understand like customer pain points and how to best solve them. Because I think we all know that stated preferences versus revealed preferences are very different. And if you're good at product management, you figure out what the revealed preferences are, not the stated ones.
So from all that, you've gone from investment banking to product management, but now you're in information security. So this is quite a transition, right?
Yes. So my startup was actually an information security startup. So I feel like my whole career has been in information security, just from various vantage points. So since I had my own startup, I've been doing product management within information security and kind of doubling down every new opportunity I take.
All right.
Fantastic. So I guess my question would be, what is the biggest contribution that behavioral science can make to informational security?
That is a huge topic that could potentially take many hours, but I will try to think of, there are two things actually. First is figuring out the best ways to counter status quo bias. Status quo bias, I would say, is just absolutely rampant and frankly is hindering the InfoSec industry by literal years. If you look at it, its thinking relative to other technology disciplines, it's just perpetually behind. And I think a lot of that is due to status quo bias. And there aren't a lot of people fighting the good fight against it, to be honest, because a lot of their power within the organization and thus their livelihoods depends on keeping the status quo in place, which is not great. The second thing is the use of choice architecture is woefully neglected in information security, particularly when it comes to tooling, whether that's consumer-facing, things like password managers, or whether it's kind of the repertoire of enterprise security tools. So things like the use of defaults. You would think that would have been an obvious thing, but it's really only in the past few years people have figured out like, hey, when someone's setting up, their user account for the first time, maybe we should require them to set up a two-factor authentication app by default. The field was very slow to even just getting to like defaults are good, and there's still a lot more work to do there. So in sum, fighting status quo bias and then leveraging choice architecture and things like the use of defaults.
Yeah, I think I'm guilty as well, even though I am a behavioral economist, in air quotes, of being awful and so predictable at setting my own passwords. So, yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think it's something that a lot of people definitely relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really tough. And I think the industry really just makes it tougher for everyone, to be honest. It makes it tough on the practitioners. It makes it tough, obviously, on consumers that we can't expect consumers to be experts and to be able to recognize a phishing email, when they're, for example, a behavioral scientist, or if they're in accounting, or if they're in sales. I think it's an unrealistic expectation, and yet that's the one the industry has placed on users thus far, which, as you might imagine, seems somewhat irrational.
So would you say, are companies benefiting from the status quo as it is? Do they not have an incentive to make a change?
Well, it's similar to, the common phrase of, do you necessarily want to find a cure, or do you want to find a treatment? Because there's more money in providing the treatment and not the cure. And through a certain lens, you can certainly view a lot of the security industry as incremental solutions that kind of put a Band-Aid on it, but aren't actually going to fundamentally solve the problem. And I would argue that most of the information security couldn't actually solve the problem. A lot of the issues we have are based on just the fundamental design of technology. And so if we're trying to put on some sort of or security tool like after the fact, just as a stopgap, of course, that's not really going to work. But again, you have billions, like I think at this point, the market size is something like 80 billion for security tools globally. That's a lot of money that does not want to actually solve the problem and to keep it going. And so for the listeners who aren't as familiar with information security, there's something called the Verizon Data Breach Report, which has been going on for many years, that reports on what the most common kind of threats are, like how companies are getting attacked. And it's the same stuff in the report year after year. They actually have to find different ways of making things seem new and interesting so people read it, but the statistics are essentially the same. So you don't really see meaningful progress, but people are still making lots of money. So you have to wonder.
That actually raises a couple of questions, I suppose. Do you think this is likely to change, or is it just such an incentive structure that this is now the new status quo for how money is being made?
Well, there was a movement called anti-sec back, I believe, in the late 90s and early 2000s, which basically made the same points I'm making. So I'm not sure if that's particularly auspicious as far as whether things will change if it's been this way for 20 or so years. Mm-hmm. I'm certainly fighting, I would say, the good fight against it, and there's some other people as well. But I think until we start moving some of the security functions actually outside of the security industry itself and more on the people that are building software, that are building systems. There's this notion with DevOps, which is obviously a huge movement that's been happening in tech, where you can't have responsibility and accountability be disparate. Otherwise, if you're building the software and you aren't responsible for like anything that goes wrong with it, you have an incentive problem, right? It kind of becomes a moral hazard type of issue. And there's something very similar in security where security people are in charge of fixing the security problems, but not in building the actual technology. So there's kind of incentive misalignment in both directions. And I think until that's fixed, it won't change. But the good news is there are people trying to fix it in that way, which maybe will change something. But I'm personally not that optimistic, to be honest.
Well, it's great to hear someone actually talking about this because, I hadn't really thought about this idea of the misalignment of incentives, and it seems like it's a huge structural issue that is sort of quite easily brushed under the carpet, I guess.
It is. I think a lot of times people outside of information security kind of view people within as, or at least I can certainly say information security thinks it's perceived as kind of like hero, that's very noble and, fighting this ardent battle against hackers and everybody's doing the right thing. And it's just so far from the truth. Egos abound, money abounds. There are all these incentive problems. And it's honestly kind of a hot mess. And I think if people realize that more from the outside, they would be kept up at night a little bit more.
I guess, this is the sort of the big picture behavioral science viewpoint. But I guess maybe if we zoom into more of like an individual level, what are the sort of the biggest security mistakes that, a listener to this podcast might be making in their day-to-day life that they might not recognize as a security mishap?
Yeah, definitely. I think as when it comes to individual security, there are a few things that I think are valuable to do. Kind of basic things include having a password manager because it allows you to generate like strong random passwords, and it removes a lot of choice fatigue because if you have one password you have to enter in once in order to access all of your passwords that can then be filled in with ease across various different websites. It's a lot easier to remember one versus a bunch of them. The second thing is two-factor authentication, which it does add a slight bit of friction because now you have to enter in a secondary code, but it raises the cost of attack enormously. An attacker would then have to not only get your username and password, they would also have to compromise like your phone in order to like steal whatever number is generated from the application. And there's also a very short window for them to do that. And it's very unlikely for the vast majority of attackers, like barring nation states, that they would be willing to do that. So those are really the two steps that are most likely to help you on an individual level.
I wonder, I don't know is there any data that we have to know how many people are actually taking steps like this to have password managers or to have two-step authentication?
That actually leads to a great point, which is that the security industry is terrible at measurement. They are not data-driven generally. There's some statistics, like I mentioned, like with the Verizon data breach investigations report. But very rarely do you see, particularly things like user research, where you're actually looking to see, just really basic A/B testing, like what's the control group versus like the treatment with the two-factor authentication, like do they end up opting out? Like there's just none of that from what I've seen. Maybe it's some of the individual, solution companies, like the ones actually providing two-factor authentication. They have something internally proprietary, but I've certainly never seen kind of these widespread studies on user behavior when it comes to security. It's just not something we see.
I find that quite peculiar, given how I thought your industry would be incredibly data-driven because there is so much data in it.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack as well. Part of the problem is, again, I think with some of the status quo bias in place, there's a bit of a fear and a kind of fear of uncertainty in particular on what will be uncovered. Particularly if you start to get into, for instance, like collecting data on which solutions are working. Is your security program working? Mm-hmm. It's a lot easier just to say that you can't measure it than to measure it and realize that you're failing, right? Particularly from a job security standpoint. So there's a danger there. It's also somewhat difficult to collect security data to a certain extent, though there are some people, including myself, that would argue that it's easier than the industry is making it out to be. But certainly on the user research side, there have been plenty of times where I just bring up really basic UX concepts, like I said, like just control group versus treatment. And they never really thought about it that way. They never thought about, okay, let's test like a small population of, let's say, employees in our enterprise and see whether, if we implement, for example, this two-factor authentication solution, like what do the users think about it? Do they end up opting out of the program? Like, what are those statistics? They aren't aware of it. So I guess part of it's awareness. But again, it's a lot easier if you're in an industry and if you're in a function where you're kind of allowed to be a gatekeeper and you're kind of allowed to steamroll people some of the time. It's just easier to just go do it than have to worry about measurement.
Sure. But to have or to be able to test or to even think of testing a control group and a treatment group or just have a tool of measurement there, this all sounds very, don't mean to offend anyone, very basic behavioral science. I think the average psychologist would have been able to come up with this after a couple of months of education. Do you have many behavioralists? No, sorry, behavioralist is not the right term. Do you have many behavioral economists, or do you have many behavioral scientists or psychologists within your own company, within your own sector? Are they represented in this field much?
No, I mean, there's a reason why even me with my paltry undergrad education has been able to even start the education in the industry about behavioral science. I wish there was someone way more qualified than I am who was talking about it more. And I can probably count the number of people studying this and applying it to information security on my hands, to be honest. We all kind of know each other on Twitter. But it's really ignored. I don't know if it's because the behavioral scientists figure that we have it all figured out. Certainly on the information security side, there is kind of the poo-pooing of like quote unquote soft skills, though I would personally take great offense at arguing that behavioral science is a soft skill, particularly with all the stats involved. Especially, I would say, don't throw stones in glass houses. We're an industry that isn't measuring anything or performing statistics. But anyway, it's a separate point. But yeah, you don't see much of this. You're right. It is absolutely basic. This stuff is very basic. And a lot of what I try to teach at like conferences or in private sessions is really basic behavioral science. But that's just where the industry is, unfortunately.
I mean, in fact, it almost makes it even more exciting because there's so much that we don't know. Like, it's such uncharted territory.
Yeah, it would be really easy for someone like yourselves who's looking at like research areas to choose information security as an area just because you're right, like it's greenfield. No one's really explored it much.
Yeah. And whose responsibility do you think it is really to collect this data? Because I assume that it's not easy to collect the data unless you have the cooperation of, information security companies. Is there a way that we could potentially bypass these companies, or do we have to go through them to get this data?
I think it depends on the type of data. So for example, if you're looking at kind of these user studies to test like, okay, what are the opt-out rates for something like two-factor authentication? I think that's something you could probably replicate on your own with just using the apps, some of the apps that are free and available. I think those sorts of studies are doable. When it starts to get into more of the attack type data and seeing, for example, like efficacy of security tools, like seeing if you can, for instance, convince security teams to overcome like their time inconsistency issues and actually start investing in like long-term strategy versus short-term. I think that's a lot more difficult because you would have to, I don't think you could necessarily do it with students in a lab, though I think you could get inventive potentially. And certainly attack data itself, like you're probably going to have to either get it from some sort of government entity, get it from one of the incident response companies, luckily of which there are many. The security vendors, I'm not sure how valuable their data is necessarily, except for, again, like the incident response companies. But some of the major corporations, for example, thinking about some of the Silicon Valley tech giants, they definitely are collecting a lot of data, and they have a wealth of data on kind of, again, attack-related statistics that could be valuable. But I honestly think if you're just starting with, okay, let's apply something to information security, you could kind of bootstrap a lot of the data yourself.
So is this then the next step for behavioral science? Because we always ask our interviewees the question, with perspective to where they are field-wise, in your case, information security, what would be ideally the impact of behavioral science? But in this case, the ideal impact of behavioral science would be any impact, it almost seems.
To exist.
Yeah, to be applied at all.
Exactly. So one kind of simple thing, for instance, that I've been trying to evangelize is just belief prompting, like getting people to think like more drawing from like behavioral game theory, but thinking one step ahead to their opponent. And it's remarkable kind of what you're saying, like the amount that's considered quite innovative. And like I've heard the term mind-blowing referring to it when it's really just, I would say, very basic, particularly like decision trees in behavioral game theory, very straightforward. The whole notion of just games in general and thinking that way, you would assume that people would be thinking about that more given its attack and defense. And I would say they definitely are confident in their knowledge of game theory 101. But as far as like actually applying it to defensive strategy, we don't see it. So yeah, to your point, like I think as far as where behavioral science can help, it's everywhere. It's just from enterprise defense strategy to overcoming, like I said, the status quo bias, overcoming even things like availability bias. You see a lot of defensive decision-making driven by headlines like, ooh, this big scary vulnerability came out. Clearly we need to now allocate resources towards, other vulnerabilities, combating other vulnerabilities like that going forward. And it's like, well, not necessarily. It's just that's what's fresh in your mind. It's really simple things like that, just trying to figure out how to get them more data-driven. That's going to make a huge impact. And certainly on the user side, like just really basic UX, really basic, we talked about like experiments would go a long way towards making security tools far more usable, which ultimately improves security, because I am a huge believer that security that isn't usable isn't actually security. You have to make the easy path the secure path, otherwise it won't work.
Fair enough.
Okay, so that's good news for anyone who wants to do a PhD research project in behavioral science and doesn't really know what to do. Do something in information security.
Exactly.
Yeah, genuinely, you can pick any topic within the field of information security. All of them are good. All of them are valid. You might just not find any literature on it, but means it's all still fresh. It's all still novel, and for any academics amongst us, that means it's publishable. So go for it.
Exactly. And you'll probably get hired afterwards too, because there's the notorious talent shortage in the industry.
There we go.
Is it too late for me to change my PhD thesis?
Yes, it is.
Damn it. All right. Well, all of this is, we're looking sort of into the future of information security and the role of behavioral science. But have you recognized any trends, like current trends in information security as of late?
Well, I think I would be remiss not to mention COVID-related impacts, because it has sent the security industry largely scrambling. For instance, there was such a focus on applying technology solutions. And again, with status quo bias, everybody was very content with the idea that their Organizations will be organized as people sitting at desks within a network perimeter, connecting within that network perimeter that is shielded from the outside world, that they hadn't actually prepared any contingency plans for when that wasn't true. So you see a large part of the industry now grappling with the idea of you cannot have anyone on-prem. They're maybe using laptops over which you don't have control. You can't secure any network perimeter because it's everyone in their home office. You can't rely on the technology solutions you already knew, and you can't just copy paste those solutions over to things like cloud technology. The InfoSec industry has definitely tried to do that. For example, like they like to think in a very firewall centric model. So firewalls are meant to like kind of block known bad IP addresses, like network connections coming from known bad actors. But that's not really analogous to the threat model of cloud-based systems, but InfoSec has tried to just port over those technologies. So now they're having to do all of that in a very short period of time, and they're really struggling. They just didn't have the kind of incident response and contingency plans in place. So I would say that's the biggest trend, is a lot of the InfoSec industry is now just grasping that, oh yeah, we have to completely rethink how we've been doing things, and that's scary. There's a lot of uncertainty, and I suspect there's a lot of very poor decision making going on right now.
But I mean, would you say that, on average, people are more vulnerable to information security attacks at the moment during COVID? And what do those attacks sort of look like?
I think it depends. There's certainly been a lot of COVID-related phishing, including, and you all may be able to tell the incident of misalignment immediately, but there was one notable instance of a large financial services company that did a phishing simulation exercise where they said something like COVID, like employee infected list. And keep in mind, this is after they had forced their employees to work in close quarters well beyond when most people were sending people to work from home. So it's pretty natural, like people would click on that list because they're terrified that maybe they've been working next to someone. But it's a phishing simulation, and they were, of course, greeted with that message and chastised for clicking on this link. And it's like, well, that's a fantastic way to be viewed with complete mistrust going forward as a security team. And if you thought even remotely in the future, you would realize like, okay, well, they're probably not going to raise any issues to us in the future because they're going to be scared and resentful of us. But the fact remains there are like a lot of COVID-related phishing emails where people are using the topic, for links that are purportedly news or reports on it and are actually like malicious links or malicious PDFs. Certainly see that. Some social media-based activity. Interestingly, some attacks, at least for a time, kind of dropped off, I suspect, while some both criminal groups as well as nation states were scrambling with their own working from home transition. It's kind of interesting to see some of the trends in that area. But I think as far as what individuals can do, it's just being careful as always with like clicking any sort of link. Again, having some sort of password manager in place as well as two-factor authentication will also go a long way. Windows is actually, it has a bad reputation, but it's surprisingly hardy at this point. So making sure that you're doing scans, it's kind of like a lot of the basics. It's a lot of security is just making sure you're having a lot of the basics in place. I would say overall the outlook is somewhat pessimistic. There is a silver lining, which is that this will start to, it's almost a forcing function to get information security practitioners to start thinking in these new ways and start adopting infrastructure like cloud or microservices like containers and stuff, which have a lot more security benefits by design. And so we could ultimately, after this massive road bump, see some improvements in the industry because it's frankly forcing them to get out of their status quo bias because they don't have a choice anymore.
I'm actually quite curious. So you mentioned this is quite specific phishing scam. Now, when I think of email phishing more specifically, I always remember the emails, and I think we must have gotten them by this age, like say about 10 years ago, about it was always the same stuff. It made no sense to me, about a Nigerian prince who had found gold, who was a multi-billionaire, and the only thing, and he wanted to share that wealth with you because apparently we're best friends, although I don't know him. And, he just needed my, credit card details, passport information, the type of stuff you really shouldn't be giving out. But this is a very old example. And I think currently, if you send that email, like, you couldn't even fool my grandmother. Not that she has a laptop, but,
So there's something similar happening these days called business email compromise, which is the acronym BEC for short. And we've seen actually a lot of these issues where people are wiring like $50 million or just millions of dollars over because it's not even like a malicious link or anything. It looks like it's a legitimate request, say from your CISO or from an actual client, to wire money to some account, and people will do it. And this is why I actually think for those who maybe are more on the gray area of the moral spectrum, who are behavioral scientists, there's a lot of research to be done actually in the behavioral science of offense. For instance, how can you craft emails best to trick people into wiring you money or to click on those links? And I think actually some of the study of that would be very revealing in how we should potentially counter it and how we can better look out for it. But you'd be amazed. There was I think SS&C was a company maybe a few years ago that had a lawsuit filed against them because by one of their clients because they wired money, I think, out of the client's account into some attacker's account, and they were supposed to require, I think, 4 confirmations. But obviously you have different attentional demands, and it was a very large demanding client. And so presumably the person who was wiring the money thought, well, I've done this a million times before. Like it looks like it's from a valid sender's address, so I'm just going to do it without the approvals. So then that brings you to, okay, as a behavioral scientist, how can we start creating that sort of choice architecture to ensure that those approvals aren't as easily bypassed? How can we start putting approvals more in the work stream so you can't opt out of them? And that's the sort of stuff where I feel like, maybe that's more like 201 versus 101 in the industry, but things like that would make a huge difference even for really basic attacks like BEC.
Oh, fascinating.
So is that the future? Is that the future of phishing, where normally it's very, very personal? Nigerian prince wants to give you money, and now it becomes almost business related because people are targeting business and client accounts rather than personal accounts? Or is this also continuing to be very, very personal?
I think they can be personal. I would say the enterprise ones are very personal because most of the time it's very targeted. They've done what's called recon for reconnaissance. Like the attacker has scoped out the company, they've figured out who some of their clients are, and that's how they figure out, okay, we need to impersonate this client in order to get this money wired. And so I would consider that very personal, but it's true. Something that most people, I would say, use Gmail or Outlook at this point, and their spam filters are very good. So for the most part, they're filtering out kind of the obvious scams. So I would say most of the phishing we see today is more on the business email compromise side. For consumers, I would say, not sure how prevalent it is, but at least a few years ago, the big thing was malvertising. Where it would be advertising, inline in a company's website, something like, hey, click on this because, you want your Viagra prescription or whatever else. And people would click it and it would download malware.
Ah, interesting.
So we saw that for a while.
I was going to say, it's interesting to think that maybe, these attackers or scam phishing email people are better at doing A/B testing than information security.
Absolutely.
They seem to have got it nailed. They understand the behavioral science. So they just need 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 to click, and it's just a game of numbers, I guess.
Exactly. In fact, going back to the Nigerian prince scam, I believe there was research done, or maybe even interviews conducted, where they were purposefully making those emails as ridiculous as possible because they specifically wanted to have success among people who were that gullible. Like they wanted to specifically filter out, the more discerning people, and hit the people that were more easily fooled. Because if those people responded initially, even with horrible spelling errors and everything else, it was much more likely that they would follow through with the whole thing. So that's actually purposely crafted it to look terrible because it weeded out the people who could potentially call them out.
But that is a behavioral science tactic. That's called foot in the door.
It is.
That's nice. Well, not nice.
Right?
Not, from a scientific perspective, great work. But yeah,
you're getting too excited over this.
You can study the behavioral science of offense for sure. It's a very, very interesting area.
Yeah, well, it just reminds me of Catch Me If You Can. It's like, if you can't beat the criminal, hire them, study them, and use that information to come up with counterattacks. Yeah. Oh, super fascinating.
I actually, the scam that I keep getting, which I find very, very personal, especially because as a PhD student, we don't actually pay taxes. At least we have quite a few limits before we have to pay taxes, which as a poor PhD student, we're never going to reach those limits anyway. But I hope I get the acronym right. The HRMC, which I think is the Her Majesty's Tax Revenue Compliance something.
Yeah. Revenue and Customs.
Very nice. At least Sarah knows. I'm not British, so I don't really know anything about it. But they keep sending me emails that, I either I haven't paid my taxes, which unsurprisingly, because I don't pay tax, and that I actually owe them thousands and thousands of pounds. And the initially when I saw that email, of course, I kind of panicked because I don't like being accused of owing someone thousands of pounds.
Of course.
It's I pride myself on being good with money. I felt quite disturbed. But yeah, I can imagine that people, because this is from a behavioral science perspective, if you can trigger someone's fear, so if you can trigger someone's system 1, if you believe in dual system processing, they won't activate system 2. They won't even remotely rationally approach the situation. And I can imagine in that case, you would cling some, or you would, get to some questionable sites, you would click on some very questionable links. And if the fear persists long enough, you might actually book over these thousands of pounds or however much you owe this fake government agency. Well, not even put an agency, it's just a hacker, I suppose. But is that how most information security breaches happen? Is it fear that drives their success?
I would say a lot of it is that, yes, a lot of it is also, frankly, just miscalculation on what the priorities are in enterprise defense, which again goes back to a lot of bias and particularly prospect theory is something I've looked at a lot, which again is very basic from a behavioral science point of view.
I wouldn't call it that basic. I really wouldn't call it that basic. I've met plenty of behavioral scientists that if they had to do cumulative prospect theory mathematically, they'd be crying in a corner by now. So
that's true. I mean, more conceptually. So as an example, if you think about the classic example is something like Stuxnet, which is an attack at least allegedly the U.S. government conducted against Iran, where they had very, very, at least at the time, sophisticated malware that ended up causing a malfunction in Iran's centrifuges. Enterprise companies will assume that they will have that level of attack, which is probably a 0.1% probability at best. So they're overestimating that, and they underestimate what we've been talking about. Things like phishing, which will probably be 60% of the attacks they face, but they will underinvest in that area and overinvest in trying to stop the Stuxnet-like attacks. So that's one thing we see. You're completely right, by the way, that fear is a huge, huge driver. I think fear is a huge part of why we see these biases particularly manifest. And by the way, your realization is well ahead of, I would say, most InfoSec professionals. And that's with 30 minutes, far more than a lot of practitioners have while being 20 years in the industry. So that, I think, shows you how much we desperately need behavioral science in its own right.
No, you just need me.
Yes, exactly. One interesting thing on kind of the morally gray side of things is one very clever attack that some attackers will do is they'll conduct what's called a DDoS, a distributed denial of service, where they basically flood a company's application or website, and that causes panic. Obviously, the practitioner's like, "Oh no, we're actively under attack. Let's go look over here." And in the meantime, the attackers actually have something more sophisticated happening, where they're, let's say, exploiting a database with a bunch of customer data that they can then sell on darknet markets. And from that point, the practitioners are so busy trying to handle the DDoS, which is the loud, noisy one that gets their attention. And they're like, oh, no, we have to stop this, that they actually miss the breach of customer credentials really until it's too late. So that's another great example of leveraging that fear for evil, frankly.
Yeah. And that feeds into the sort of the attention scarcity literature,
Exactly.
which is really interesting.
I
Yes.
am surprised by how knowledgeable, like, most of these people seem that are trying to breach your security system. I find it impressive. Like, I don't know if they know behavioral science by accident, or they just read the book called, like, The Art of War, or I don't know where they find their knowledge, but they seem to be doing quite well.
So a lot of them are legitimate criminal organizations. So I think part of it is, frankly, it is kind of like the stereotype of, you know, the Aladdin type petty street thief who actually learns how to be incredibly clever and manipulative just out of necessity. I think a lot of it's that is they have a huge incentive. You know, they can be making, you know, tens of millions a year, which potentially, if you're not in one of, you know, the more expensive European or North American countries, like that's a lot of money. So there's a huge incentive for them to figure out all these tricks and test things out and see what works. Again, a lot of it is a numbers game where they just have to know what we call in the industry spray and pray to a certain extent, but also a lot of what we're seeing today is they're trying to figure out how to make things more automated. So I often joke that they're leveraging things like cloud infrastructure and microservices and automation tools far more than defenders are. They're actually ahead of the curve technology-wise because they want to reduce their own cost of attack. They want the highest ROI possible. So it's kind of that incentive mechanism in some ways is stronger than on the defensive side for them to successfully attack, get the most money possible. Or on the defender side, the status quo has been that everybody's kind of like failing their way to the top for 20 years. And so what's really the incentive to do much better if you're still getting paid, you know, sometimes a seven-figure paycheck as a chief information security officer? Why should you rethink things if you're almost assuredly going to get a six-figure job out of school doing information security, right?
Yeah, and it almost makes sense for the people who are attacking individuals' information to also set up information security companies, you know, in the biggest scam there possibly could be. I don't want to give anyone any ideas. But,
no, you should.
Yeah, for the criminal groups listening.
Yes, for anyone who's participating in criminal activity, please stop.
You can do so much better. You can actually, you know, now go to the job market, leverage this quote unquote work experience and start your own company. And, you know, if you just outperform the rest, which you might with all the criminal smarts that you have by this stage, you might be very successful and get that six-figure, you know, salary. I mean, live your best life.
It's honestly true. Like a lot of what we see in the industry, some of the best solutions. So as an example, Duo Security in the US has been considered a great success because they started out as a small little startup in Ann Arbor. And they sold to Cisco for something like $2.3 billion, which is a lot of money. So definitely a success story. They were one of the providers of a very good two-factor authentication app. And at least one of the founders, if not both, actually have former like offensive hacking experience. Actually, one of the founders of my own company has offensive hacking experience as well. And a lot of times that former, if you're an attacker, you can definitely see a lot of ways where you would want to create headaches for yourself, which leads to better solutions than someone who's, let's say, like former sales and security or someone who's been doing defense their whole life. There's also something called red teams, which are basically teams made up of people who are generally also offensive-minded, who attack, who work within the enterprise or paid quite handsomely to do this, and basically just work on attacking the enterprise in a way that's realistic. And importantly, they perform alternative analysis. So in some ways, I view one of the best functions of a red team as trying to counter biases, trying to poke holes in the logic of defense. And you can only really do that if you've been on the other side of things.
Yeah. Again, I guess links back nicely to game theory.
Exactly.
Takes one to know one. Love that.
Yeah.
So how much of your field do you think has a background in which is now very nicely called offensive hacking?
Ooh, as a percentage basis, I'm not sure. It's not too much. It's definitely a smaller portion of the market. But it's pretty widespread. There are a lot of people who, particularly in countries like the United States, in some ways I lament, if you've seen the movie Hackers, it's a bunch of teenagers who hack a bunch of stuff. It's much harder to do that these days. Turns out various regulatory bodies in the United States frown upon teenagers hacking things. It's much easier to do that in countries that don't have extradition to the US. So
I see.
cry one out for the teenagers in the US and perhaps the UK and other parts of Europe as well. But yeah, a lot of security professionals have started out doing like penetration testing or other sorts of offensive research that then transitioned to defense, frankly, because the money is very good. That's pretty much the long and short of it. And of course, if you're, again, in a country that maybe doesn't have quite the same level of infrastructure in a kind of operational sense as the information security industry in the United States, for example, like Eastern Europe, they have some security professionals on the defensive side, but it's still generally probably more lucrative to be hacking things than to be defending against them, because you're not going to pay the same sort of six-figure salaries as you see in the US on the defensive side.
I think the punishment in the Eastern European countries might also be a bit more severe.
I mean, I guess I have a question that I guess is a little bit adjacent to COVID, which is about, whether or not this sudden uptake in the use of video conferencing apps for communication, is there anything that the information security sector is, currently quite worried about with us sort of moving most of our communication via Zoom and Teams, for example, or are they quite secure platforms?
I certainly wouldn't call them secure platforms. I'm less familiar with Teams. There was a big hullabaloo in the industry a few weeks back over Zoom because there were a lot of issues in that, security issues in that. But again, really basic stuff that you all would get is that the security industry was like, why are people using Zoom when they know that there are vulnerabilities? And it's like, well, it turns out it's easy to use, and it's what a lot of people use, and it's straightforward for enterprises to set up. This is not rocket science why people are using it, even if it's less secure. It's not like everyone buys like the safest car as a rule. Sometimes they want to buy like cars that look nice. And so to me, it's just very obvious, but you'd be amazed how much the information security industry just fails to understand that people want things that are usable, and maybe security is a secondary priority. So I think there's certainly more that could be done on the security side. And luckily, Zoom has started to be more transparent in kind of how they're thinking about security and the state of their security. But ultimately, it all goes back to like making the easiest path the secure path. If you don't do that, like people are going to use the less secure option because it's the easiest one to use. And InfoSec in general just fails to acknowledge that point, which is why it as an industry keeps failing, I think.
It's actually very interesting that you mentioned this, because when I think of, using Skype, Zoom, Teams, I mean, the list goes on, especially during these days. But if I'm being very honest, I don't think security is a massive priority for me. I don't think if someone asked me, why are you using, name any of these platforms, I don't think it would even come up in conversation. Oh, I'm choosing this platform quite actively because it is, end-to-end encrypted, or it has good security, whatever. Which I find quite funny, because I know quite a few people, so this is more anecdotally, I suppose, that have stopped using WhatsApp and have moved on to things such as Telegram because they seem safer and the data is better protected. Do you think there is, even within the information security sector, when it comes to, moving from Zoom to WhatsApp, are there different valuations for security? And which is actually the highest valued?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I would agree that in general, most people are not thinking about security. And I would also argue, which the InfoSec industry does not tend to argue, that why should you care? I think it's reasonable to expect that security would be baked into your tools anyway. And I personally don't think it's really on the part of the user to have to be an expert in security and to investigate all of the different security features themselves. I think that's kind of unrealistic. It's kind of like when a doctor prescribes you something. Generally, you're not expected to go do all of the research on the different pharmacologies yourself, right? The InfoSec industry would say that you would be stupid and naive if you chose this pill over that pill without any degree in pharmacology. But anyway, so I think certainly within security itself, the industry itself, they think that InfoSec priority should always be number one, just as a rule. And so you should never use Zoom. The joke is that you maybe want to make your own environments that you use, as far as like your laptop or whatever else, so hostile that even an attacker wouldn't know how to use it. But obviously, who's going to operate like that? Like we have to get stuff done. So I think there's definitely a huge recognition problem that InfoSec just refuses to really study and certainly refuses to acknowledge what the priorities are outside of the industry, and will label anyone who doesn't share their priorities as stupid or lazy or etc.
We've covered so much today just within 1 hour, and I think I've definitely learned a hell of a lot.
Same.
But if you could summarize, I guess, maybe in like 1 or 2 sentences, Kelly, what would you like our listeners to take away from the episode?
I think it kind of goes back to that fear and understanding that the nature of kind of the information security game is one that's very tense, very stressful, very time sensitive, where fear abounds. So understanding, the way I've put it for security people is that system one can be thought of as like lizard brain. So understanding that lizard brain is going to be very, very active in the vast majority of security situations, I think would go a long way in informing what we can do better. Understanding that there are attentional demands, there are different competing goals, there are, a million things that you could be doing. And the question is, how do you prioritize what you should be doing? And how do you check your biases that are hot and ready because, there's a new incident and it's time sensitive and, oh my gosh, someone's attacking us. Like how to manage all of those factors, and even just starting with one of those factors, I think would go a long way in helping the industry.
Fantastic. I think very well said. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I think I speak for both of us when I say this has been an incredibly fascinating discussion.
No, thank you so much for having me. It was a wonderful, wonderful discussion.
I'm going to specialize in becoming a hacker. I want that
Yes.
that loot money and then that 6-figure salary. I feel like there's much to gain as a behavioral scientist.
Thank you very much, Kelly.
Yes, thank you so much. So that was an interesting chat about behavioral science meets information security, or better put, information security hasn't met behavioral science yet. I'm really surprised.
Yeah,
I'm really surprised.
It was quite shocking, actually. I thought there hasn't really been that much done, like in terms of applying behavioral science in InfoSec, which is, yeah, as you say, it seems quite crazy. Yeah, I mean, on the positive, it means that there's just so much left to be done, so much research to be done. So, that's the silver lining, I guess. There's lots of ways that we can improve it.
Yeah, I suppose that is one way of looking at it. No, I'm genuinely surprised because for me, information security, to me, it seems like a field that has so much data. Because that's effectively it's a data-run sector. No data, no tools, no nothing. So the data is there, but then I guess also, as Kelly mentioned before, there is an incentive structure that prefers treatments to cures. Which, let's not blame information security for that as a sector, because we see this in many a sector. This is a very used business model. But yeah, just very surprising. My main takeaway for this is genuinely, I should have been a hacker. I should have gotten into this stuff so much earlier.
Well, I think your skills would be very well used in the hacking industry.
My skills wouldn't be in hacking, though. My skills would be in writing incredibly persuasive phishing emails.
Yeah. I mean, I think I definitely learnt that I now need to go away and get a password manager, because that's something that I actually don't have. Any hackers listening, please don't hack me, because by the time you listen to this, hopefully everything will be locked down, so you can't even do it anyway. But
one thing to write in the diary: have a password manager before we upload this episode.
Yes, for sure.
Probably clever. But
it seems like it's relatively simple for us, on an individual level to try and, to protect our data and our information, but we're just not doing it. So
yeah, we're just lazy. But then again, I don't think the average hacker is looking for my stuff. Like, apparently this stuff is moving business. Like, now we're hacking. We are, as if we're hacking. Yeah, can hardly open a word. No, so people who are actively into offensive hacking, which I, by the way, think is a great term, are actively looking into hacking businesses and business client accounts. And I don't think they can really be bothered by looking at my old coding scripts. And somehow I find that quite reassuring.
Yeah, I would take some reassurance from that. But yeah, no, it was a great conversation, and I certainly learnt a lot which is the whole point of this process.
Yes.
So
Yes.
we did it. We did the podcast. And if you do want to, keep up to date with what Kelly's doing, we'll put some links in the description about where you can find her on social media and her business and all of that good stuff.
So yeah, I suppose that is it for today. I hope you learned some cool stuff about the interaction or lack thereof of behavioral science and information security. And if you are a young behavioral scientist, you might seriously want to consider going into this field, because here is where opportunities lie. This is the future. And otherwise just become a behavioral scientifically informed hacker. Either way, let us know how you feel about this podcast on the socials, and happy hacking!
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Questioning Behaviour. Tune in to our next episode to find out which behaviour we will be questioning next.
A podcast is a bit of a one-way medium. We're talking to you, but you can't actually talk back. If you'd like a more interactive exchange, do reach out to us via our socials. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn. Just look for Questioning Behaviour. We're also on Twitter using @QB_podcast. We're looking forward to hearing from you. See ya!
Bye!